The morning Ruth Calloway walked into Harlan Briggs' General Store in Cedar Hollow, Colorado, with 3 copper pennies in her cracked palm and hunger in her children's eyes. She was not looking for charity. She was looking for flour. Just flour, enough to make a week's worth of flatbread for her 2 boys. And she had counted those 3 pennies 14 times on the walk into town, pressing them together in her fist as though the pressure of her fingers might somehow multiply them. She had walked 4 miles in broken boots through November mud to get to that store. And Harlan Briggs laughed at her. He laughed the way a man laughs when he has forgotten what it costs a person to ask for help. Loud, through his nose, leaning on his counter with the comfortable cruelty of someone who has never once gone to bed with an empty stomach and cannot imagine what that particular darkness feels like from the inside. What Harlan Briggs did not see, what neither of them saw, was the mountain cowboy standing in the shadow of the dry goods aisle, still as a pine tree in windless air, watching every single second of it. Asterisk if you believe in justice, in kindness that costs something, in the God who sees what proud men overlook. Please like this story, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe so you never miss another tale from the frontier. What happens next will stay with you. Asterisk. Cedar Hollow, Colorado, in the winter of 1878 was the kind of town that looked promising from a distance and revealed its hardness up close, the way most frontier places did. It sat at the foot of the San Juan Mountains like something that had been set down carelessly and never quite straightened. Its single main street a ribbon of mud and horse traffic bracketed by wooden storefronts with hand-painted signs and false fronts that made the buildings look taller and more permanent than they truly were. There was a sheriff's office, a livery, a saloon called the Copper Lantern, a small white church that held services every Sunday with or without a full congregation, and Harlan Briggs' General Store, which was the largest building on the street and the one establishment in Cedar Hollow that every family, rich or struggling, eventually needed to face. Harlan Briggs had owned that store for 11 years. He was a thick-necked man in his 50s with a red face and small eyes that were very good at calculating the value of things and very poor at calculating the worth of people. He extended credit to the ranchers he respected and collected debts from the families he didn't, and the line between those 2 categories had everything to do with land and horses and a man's last name, and very little to do with character. He was not a villain in the way that outlaws were villains. He carried no gun, robbed no stagecoaches, threatened no one with physical harm. His cruelty was the quieter kind, the kind that wears the costume of business and practicality, the kind that is hardest to name and therefore hardest to fight. Ruth Calloway had been fighting it, in one form or another, for 3 years. She had come to Cedar Hollow in 1875 with her husband, Joseph, who had believed with the full force of his considerable faith that the Colorado mountains held a cattle rancher's future for a family willing to work hard enough to claim it. Joseph Calloway was not wrong about the mountains. Exactly. They were magnificent and full of possibility, green-pastured in summer and brutal in winter, demanding everything a man had and occasionally giving back more than he'd put in. What Joseph had not accounted for, because no amount of faith fully accounts for it, was the cattle fever that swept through the San Juan valleys in the autumn of 1876, taking 30 head of their 60-animal herd in 2 terrible weeks, and Joseph himself before the first snow fell, leaving Ruth with 2 small boys, Nathan, age 7, and little George, who had just turned 5, a half-built ranch house, 23 remaining cattle, and a Colorado winter bearing down like a judgment. She had survived that first winter on stubbornness and prayer in roughly equal measure, with some assistance from their neighbor Agnes Hart, a 60-year-old widow woman who rode her own horse, mended her own fences, and had strong opinions about the therapeutic value of keeping busy. Agnes had shown Ruth how to stretch a side of salt pork through 6 weeks of meals, how to bank a fire so it held through the coldest nights, how to read the mountain weather and the color of the evening clouds. Between Agnes's knowledge and Ruth's refusal to quit, the Calloway Ranch had limped through to spring, and then through another summer, and now into their 3rd Colorado winter. Leaner each season, the cattle herd slowly diminishing as Ruth sold animals to cover what the land could not, the boys growing faster than her ability to clothe them. The roof of the ranch house developing opinions about rain that she addressed with buckets and determination, and a running list of repairs she could not yet afford. The 3 copper pennies were not an accident or an oversight. They were the arithmetic of a woman who had already spent everything else. She had sold her second-to-last cow the previous week to cover what she owed the blacksmith for reshoeing her horse, because without the horse there was no way to work the land, and without the land there was no future, and so the cow had gone. The money from the cow had covered the blacksmith and the back amount she owed on Nathan's winter boots and a small debt at the church that had been quietly bothering her conscience for 2 months. What remained after all of that was 3 pennies and a 4-mile walk and the knowledge that her boys had eaten the last of the cornmeal that morning. She pushed open the door of Briggs' General Store at 9:30 in the morning, the little bell above the door announcing her arrival, and she walked to the counter with her chin up and her broke boots leaving mud tracks on the wooden floor. Harlan Briggs looked up from his ledger book and his expression did the thing it always did when Ruth Calloway walked in. It shifted from neutral to something just south of welcoming, a subtle repositioning that said without words that he considered her presence in his store a transaction to be managed rather than a customer to be served. She told him what she needed. 1 small sack of flour, she said, and she placed the 3 pennies on the counter with a steadiness that cost her more than she would ever let him see. She told him it was what she had just now, but that she would have more after the new year when she sold her next animal, and she would make good on the difference then, as she always had. Harlan Briggs looked at the 3 pennies. He looked at them the way a man looks at something that has offended him by existing, and then he looked up at Ruth Calloway, at her mended coat and her broken boots and the particular thinness of a woman who has been feeding her children before herself for several seasons running. And he laughed. He laughed and said that he ran a store, not a charity house, and that if 3 pennies was all she had, then 3 pennies was all she'd spend, and 3 pennies didn't buy flour. It bought a handful of dried beans if she was lucky, and maybe she ought to think about whether mountain ranching was really the right occupation for a woman in her position. He said this last part with the satisfied tone of a man who believes he is being practical when he is actually being unkind, and then he slid the 3 pennies back across the counter toward her hand. Ruth Calloway did not cry. She had trained herself out of crying in public the same winter she had trained herself to butcher her own chickens, not because she was hard, but because she could not afford the luxury of being seen as weak in a place where weakness was treated as an invitation. She picked up her 3 pennies and she said, quietly, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Briggs," and she turned to leave. She had taken 2 steps toward the door when the voice came from the dry goods aisle. "I'll cover it." The voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not raise it because he had never needed to. Ruth stopped walking. Harlan Briggs stopped smiling. And from the shadow between the shelf of tobacco tins and the hanging rack of leather goods, a man stepped into the light of the store's front window, and Cedar Hollow's General Store became, in that moment, a very different room from the one it had been 30 seconds before. His name was Silas McCord, and if you had asked anyone in the San Juan mountain range about him, you would have gotten one of 2 answers depending on who you asked. The valley ranchers, the ones who ran large herds and sat on the town council and had attended Harlan Briggs' Christmas suppers, would have told you that Silas McCord was a solitary man, strange in his ways, who ran a small horse operation up on the eastern slope and came to town rarely and kept to himself entirely. The mountain men, the trappers and the prospectors and the small claim miners who worked the high country above the tree line would have told you something different. They would have told you that Silas McCord was the man who had ridden 12 miles through a blizzard to bring medicine to the Ortega family's sick children in the winter of 1876. That he was the man who had quietly paid the burial costs for 3 miners killed in a shaft collapse when no one else would step forward. That he was the man who left sacks of dried goods on the doorsteps of struggling families before first light, always without a name attached, always without any apparent need for acknowledgement. He was perhaps 45, tall and angular, with a face that had been carved by altitude and weather into something that was not handsome in any conventional sense, but was deeply, essentially honest, the kind of face you trusted immediately without being able to say why. He wore a heavy canvas coat still damp from the mountain morning, and the boots on his feet were worn but well made, and the hat on his head had seen better decades. He was carrying a list he'd been working through when Ruth Calloway had walked in, and he had gone still in that aisle the moment he heard Harlan Briggs begin to laugh, and he had stood there and listened to the whole of it with the stillness of a man storing something carefully, making sure he had it right before he acted. He walked to the counter, and he set his own list down, and he looked at Harlan Briggs with eyes that were the particular gray-blue of the mountain sky in February, clear and very cold, and entirely without apology, and he said, "Fill her order, put it on my account, and give her whatever else she needs for the week." And then he turned to Ruth Calloway, and he said, not with pity but with the simple directness of one neighbor speaking to another, "Ma'am, I won't insult you by pretending I didn't hear. You've got 2 boys to feed and a ranch to run, and winter coming hard off the mountain. Pride is a fine thing, but it keeps poorly in January. Let me do this." Ruth Calloway stood in the middle of Harlan Briggs' general store in her broken boots and her mended coat, and she looked at Silas McCord for a long, searching moment, the way a person looks when they are trying to determine whether something is genuine, because they have been disappointed often enough that hope has become a thing they approach carefully, the way you approach a fire when you're not sure how hot it burns. And what she found in Silas McCord's face was the same thing the mountain men had always found there, something reliable, something that meant what it said. She said, "I'll pay you back." And he said, "I know you will. But there's no hurry." Harlan Briggs filled the order in a silence so thick you could have cut it with a fence post. He filled it with the particular stiffness of a man who knows he has been seen doing something small and cannot find a way to make it look like something else. And he did not laugh again, not once, and he did not look directly at either of them while he worked. He filled a sack with flour and another with cornmeal, and he added salt pork and dried beans and a small paper twist of sugar, and he wrote it in Silas McCord's account with a hand that was not quite steady, and he passed the goods across the counter without a word. Ruth gathered them into her arms, and Silas carried the heaviest sack to the door, and as they walked out into the cold Cedar Hollow morning, the little bell above the door rang again, brighter, somehow, than it had when she'd entered. They stood on the boardwalk in the November light, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and Silas McCord said he had a wagon around at the livery, and he'd be glad to drive her back to her ranch if she'd allow it, seeing as 4 miles was a long way to carry provisions in broke boots. Ruth looked down at her boots. She hadn't known he'd noticed, and she almost said no, because saying no was something she had gotten very good at as a form of self-protection. But Nathan and George would be at the ranch house right now, waiting, and the flour in her arms was heavier than she'd remembered flour being, and the mountain cowboy beside her had the patient look of a man who would wait as long as it took for the right answer. She said yes. The ride back to the Calloway Ranch took an hour in Silas McCord's wagon, pulled by a pair of sure-footed mountain horses who seemed to know every rut in the road. They talked the way frontier people talk when they are feeling each other out, carefully at first, and then with increasing ease, the conversation moving from weather to cattle to the particular challenges of the San Juan winters, and then, slowly, toward the more personal territories that open up when 2 people discover they can trust each other with the truth. Ruth told him about Joseph, and about the fever, and about the 3 years of holding on. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she had learned to carry the weight of it, close to the body, efficiently, without making a show of the effort. Silas listened the way good listeners do, without rushing toward the comfort or the solution, simply receiving what she said and giving it the dignity of his full attention. He told her some of himself, too, in the quiet way of a man who is not accustomed to talking about his own life but finds, to his mild surprise, that he doesn't mind doing it. He had come to Colorado from Tennessee 12 years before, he said, after a war that had taken his brother and a marriage that had not survived the man the war returned. He had found the mountains to be the only thing wide enough and quiet enough to hold the kind of damage he had brought back from that conflict. And so he had stayed, and the mountains had done what he needed them to do, which was to be exactly what they were without asking anything of him he wasn't ready to give. When the wagon rolled up to the Calloway Ranch, Nathan and George came spilling out of the house with the uncontainable energy of small boys who have been waiting all morning, and they stopped short at the sight of the stranger driving their mother's wagon. Ruth climbed down and introduced Silas McCord to her sons, and Silas climbed down too and shook Nathan's hand with the gravity you offer a boy who is trying very hard to be the man of the house, and he crouched down to George's level and said something that made the 5-year-old laugh, a full, delighted, uninhibited laugh that rang across the cold ranch yard like a bell. Ruth stood there in the yard of the ranch her husband had believed in, and watched her boys respond to Silas McCord with the instinctive ease of children who have learned to read adults accurately. Because when you do not have the luxury of safety, you develop very quickly the ability to know who is safe. And she felt something shift inside her chest, slow and careful. The way the mountain snow shifts in early spring when the thaw is just beginning and you can't yet see it, but you can feel the change coming in the quality of the air. Silas stayed 2 hours that afternoon. He fixed the section of fence he noticed leaning badly on the north side of the yard, using tools from a box in his wagon bed, working with the efficient ease of a man who fixes things because things need fixing and not because he wants credit for the fixing. He looked at the ranch house roof and said the north corner would want attention before the heavy snows came. And he said it the way he said most things, not as an offer exactly, but as a statement of fact that contained within it a quiet willingness. Ruth did not ask him to come back and address the roof. But he came back the following Saturday with cedar shingles in his wagon and Nathan beside him on the seat, because he had stopped at the ranch on his way to town, and the boy had asked so earnestly to ride along that Silas had looked at Ruth, and Ruth had looked at her son, and the matter had settled itself. He came back after that on a loose sort of schedule that was never formally arranged, but that everyone, including Silas and Ruth and Nathan and George and old Agnes Hart next door, who watched all of this with the bright-eyed satisfaction of a woman who has been praying for something and is now watching it arrive, understood to be a pattern with a direction to it. He brought firewood in November and venison in December and a pair of small boots for George in January that he claimed he'd found in his storage, but which Agnes later confirmed he had ordered from the cobbler in Durango 3 weeks prior. Harlan Briggs heard about all of it, the way people in small frontier towns hear about everything, thoroughly and with commentary. He heard that Silas McCord had taken an interest in the Calloway widow and her ranch, and that the ranch was looking better maintained than it had in years, and that the Calloway boys had taken to calling the mountain cowboy by his first name with the comfortable familiarity of children who have decided a man belongs in their world. Briggs was not a man who learned lessons easily, but even he felt the particular discomfort of a person who has been weighed publicly and found light. And he began extending Ruth Calloway credit at his store with a suddenness and generosity that had everything to do with who was watching and almost nothing to do with who she was, though perhaps, over time, even that changes in a man, if the shame sits in him long enough. The following spring, on an April evening when the mountains were turning green above the snow line, and the Calloway Ranch was showing the first real signs of recovery, new fencing, a solid roof, the cattle herd cautiously rebuilt to 14 head, the boys taller and better shod, and Ruth herself with some of the hollowness filled back into her face by regular meals and the particular nourishment of not being entirely alone. Silas McCord sat on the porch steps of the Calloway Ranch house, with his hat in his hands, and told Ruth Calloway that he had something he wanted to ask her. He said it the way he said most important things, which was plainly and without performance, looking at his hands first, and then looking up at her with those gray-blue mountain eyes that had seen a great deal and retained the capacity for something gentle in spite of it all. He said he knew she had built what she had here on her own strength and her own faith, and that he had no intention of suggesting she needed saving, because in his observation Ruth Calloway had never needed saving. What she had needed, what most